When I ended the last video, I was getting into the cuts of lamb. And so, lamb is a young sheep. So, we have leg, loin, rack, shoulder, and breast. A lot of times, the rack is sold large and connected. This is not a big animal. And so, the primal cuts of the lamb are usually one or two portions. The loin is often cut into bone-in steaks. They look like little bitty, teeny tiny T-bone steaks. They are red meat. The shoulder is often sold kind of as a roast. So the leg and the shoulder are going to be tougher cuts of meat, and then here the loin and the rack and the breast are going to be a little bit more tender, and that's going to impact cooking as well. So it should be pink to red, very firm, some marbling in the lamb. It is similar to beef, but the flavor is very different than beef. Some people don't enjoy the flavor, and some people do. There are a lot of cultures across the world that eat lamb pretty regularly. It doesn't keep for very long, so just a couple of days in the refrigerator or freeze it for about 6 to 9 months. I wouldn't eat it out of the freezer if it had been much longer than that. When you get into veal, veal is a cow that is less than a year old. So there are five, excuse me, prime veal cuts. So just like the lamb, kind of look a lot like the lamb. Really, you could kind of relate back to the picture of the lamb. They're about the same size. So a little cow and a little lamb, their cuts are going to be kind of similar. Veal is often kind of sold in the loin, or just like you get veal cutlets in the grocery store a lot. And these are used for schnitzel, which is pretty common, which we'll talk about in other units if we haven't already talked about it. But you can also get like veal breast or shoulder or rack or little cuts. So beef is going to be one of the most commonly consumed meats. So we're going to look at the primal cuts of beef. So these would be chuck, brisket, rib, loin, and round. So here is a primal of the beef. So one really interesting thing that's very important for you to remember is when you're looking at these primal cuts, a lot of times you will see the primal cut names in the fabricated cuts for beef when you are at the grocery store. When you are closer to the head of that animal, you have more fat content than when you are at the rear. The further away from the head that you get on the primal of that animal, the leaner those cuts are going to be. So that's going to make a big difference in all of the cuts that you get. Pigs also kind of work the same way as well, but this is very evident in the cow or beef. So when it comes to the what we refer to in the tough versus tender parts, so there are a big difference in the cuts, in the fabricated and the primal cuts. When you buy the primal cuts, which are the big ones at the grocery store, the most common that you're going to see here are round or rump and chuck. And you're going to buy those a lot in a roast. And the big difference between those is the chuck roast has a lot of fat in it, and that is really going to impact cooking and how much like liquid you get out of it. You're going to have a lot more loss in that cooking process, but you're also going to have a lot more fat rendered out for use of making things like gravy and for flavoring and doing other things. The round or the rump, on the other hand, is going to be a lot leaner. And that's going to be really important because you're not going to get the same amount of juice and liquid. I'll get into that in the next video with cooking. So the chuck and the round, this is where we're going to get our tough cuts of meat. And we know that these are tough because they are found here with the legs. The working part of the animal, the muscles that are responsible for movement, are the muscles that are going to be the most tough. They're going to have the most connective tissue. They're going to require much different cooking methods than those that are in the center. So in the center, in these abdominal muscles, those are used a lot less for locomotion. And so those muscles don't move as often, they don't work as often, therefore they have a lot more tenderness to them. So when we get, you have access to this chart if you're not able to see it clearly in this video, but you can kind of look here and this breaks it down into the very specific cuts that you're going to get. So out of the rib, you're going to see here that we get like ribs, we get the rib eye, we get the rib roast. These steaks and these cuts are going to be a lot fattier because they're coming here off of that chuck. The loin is going to be much, much leaner. And so the filet really just has a fat cap. There's not hardly any marbling, but it is the most tender. You're also going to get your T-bone steaks and your porterhouse steaks there and your strip steaks. So these are going to come off of the loin. The sirloin back here closer to the round, these are going to yield your sirloin roast and sirloin tip and sirloin steaks, and they're going to be a lot leaner. And so for myself personally, I like the fat meat. I make no secret about that. I like the flavor and the moisture and the tenderness. A ribeye, particularly a big bone-in ribeye, is my favorite cut of meat. I do like a filet. Filet is really good, but I'll take a good, well-cooked, just a ribeye cooked perfectly any day. The sirloin is not much for me. The sirloin doesn't have enough fat for me. I don't care for the texture as often, and so I don't purchase that. The same reason I buy a chuck roast if I want to do a roast over a rump or round roast. I like that. I like that fat. Um, the brisket is very commonly used for barbecuing. That is a fattier and tough cut of meat. So that comes off of your chuck area here, and you can kind of see on the cow where that comes. There are also a couple of other visual aids which are linked in your presentation, which kind of show you a little bit more specific. It's important to know kind of what they look like, but also their names, because a chuck steak and a ribeye steak are very differently priced at the grocery store. But if you look at them, they kind of look the same in the package. They both have a lot of fat and some nice marbling. That chuck, though, is such a working part of that animal that is going to be very tough. If you try to cook a chuck steak without tenderization or with the wrong cooking method, you will make a beautiful, well-flavored grilled beef chewing gum is what you'll make. Like you'll just be chewing and chewing and chewing on that thing. In the same way, I wouldn't want to take a very expensive ribeye and cook it incorrectly and end up with the wrong cooking method when I could have cooked a cheaper cut of meat in that same way. So all of these visuals are available to you. They will be linked in your module in your instructional materials, and you can look at them a little bit closer. So you can see how they break down. One thing to note, the ribeye steak, you will have a bone-in or a boneless ribeye steak. When it comes to the loin, there is a porterhouse, a T-bone, but a boneless T-bone is a top loin steak or a loin or strip steak. So you'll see strip steak or loin steak, a tenderloin or fillet. That is the other side of the porterhouse. So if you have a strip steak and it's a bone-in strip steak, we refer to that as a T-bone because that is a T-shaped bone. The porterhouse, the difference between that T-bone and that porterhouse is a porterhouse has a complete tenderloin fillet on that other side. So if you remove in your fabrication the bone from the loin, then what you end up getting are strip steaks from one side and fillet from the other side. And that's how that aligns with that animal. And then you have sirloin and round, and you can get an eye of round steak. And you could try to cook it like a steak, and you would be very disappointed when you try to eat that straight off the grill. So in the next lesson with cooking, it's really important to know tough versus tender and how that breaks down. Shanks are typically reserved for soup making. They are super flavorful, but very, very tough, and generally we would put that in a soup or make stock with it. Skirt steak and flank steak come from the belly bottom, and those are often used for like fajitas and in certain types of cooking. We don't usually eat them straight as steak. They are usually cut. And then a brisket is usually a big whole piece of meat that is barbecued and cooked for a long period of time. So essentially, the basics are you purchase meat in a big primal cut, which is multiple pounds of meat, whole leg, a roast, a whole shoulder, loin, brisket, A lot of times there's a bone in there, so that's a primal cut. Fabricated cuts are your little cuts, so they are fabricated or processed or broken down, and you usually buy those in just a couple of, like, anywhere from a 1 to 2 pound package. So we typically eat pork, lamb, veal, and beef. Those are the most common. These are what we buy at the grocery store, and making sure that we look for those quality characteristics when we're buying them. And then you will have a separate lesson as well on meat labels specifically, and looking at unit pricing and meat labels and how to really decipher and break that down. So there are some vocabulary terms in the presentation. You have a link to this presentation. So, use it, and it's a good study guide. And learning how to purchase meat is really important for anyone that looks forward to cooking in their life.